IVM.
Hi, I'm Rohan Joshi, and on my podcast, the show about crypto, I've been having some pretty cool conversations with industry experts about what exactly cryptocurrency is and what makes it so exciting. If you haven't already, please check it out on the IVM Podcasts Network. Now, a quick shout out to my fellow crypto heads. We've got a listener survey going on, which will take not more than 10 minutes of your time to fill out. So please check the link in the description and help me out by filling it up. Don't forget to tune into a show about crypto on the IVM app and wherever you get your podcasts from.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. The Mahabharata is as much part of Indian life as the Ramayana. The epic about a war between cousins is not just full of stories about our own lives, but it is about life itself. Warfare, jealousy, chicanery, and morality. There are many versions of the Mahabharata and many interpretations in every conceivable language, including English. Now, Professor G.N.Devy, the well-known linguist, has written one more. A former professor of English at the Maharaja Sayaji Rao University of Baroda, Professor Devy is the founder of the Bhasha Research Center, Baroda, and the Adivasi Academy. He has worked extensively with the Adivasi and nomadic communities in India. He led the People's Linguistic Survey of India, a comprehensive documentation of all living Indian languages in 50 volumes. He has also written several books such as The Crisis Within, Painted Words, and A Nomad Called Thief. Professor Devy, welcome to the Wire Talks.
I'm happy to be with you, Sidharth. Thank you for hosting me.
So, the obvious first question, why did you write a book on the Mahabharata when there are so many already?
Well, the Mahabharata has always remained open to new interpretations, new additions, new visitors. And the Mahabharata has been with me since my childhood, in my village, in my university days, during the time I was teaching at university, and more meaningfully when I started work with Adivasis on the border of Rajasthan and Gujarat. And I thought I should try and make a sense of the poem for myself. Since I write, I thought some of these serious reflections should come down in the form of writing.
But how did you go about researching? Did you read all of them or just ignore them? Because you already knew the basic story since your childhood. So you must have had an idea that you wanted to pursue a different line. So did you say, let me not burdened by the books already written and then set out on a new journey?
Not really. I have written books in the past. Some of them are of research type, where I had to spend months and years in libraries. This book is not like those other books. This is a book talking about my engagement with the epic, what it has meant to me, but also a book satisfying many curiosities. There are still many unanswered questions related to the Mahabharata about who exactly is the poet, what exactly is the purpose of the poem, or when exactly was it written. So I have tried to answer some of those questions, and most importantly, why has the Mahabharata been so influential through the last 2000 years? So I have responded to that question in my own manner. Let me add that Abhinav Gupta wrote about the Mahabharata 1,000 years ago. Aurobindo Ghosh wrote about it 100 years ago. In our time, the meaning of this text had changed. The meaning had changed in the context of what is happening around us. And so I thought there is time for a contemporary interpretation of the epic. That's how I decided to write this book.
So if I'm not mistaken, Rajaji wrote a version also some 60, 70 years ago, didn't he?
The Mahabharata versions have been plenty. In fact, the Bhandarkar Institute put together an authorized version, doing research by comparing many available manuscripts. Nearly for 5 decades, they worked on this project and produced an authorized version. But there have been many unauthorized versions of the Mahabharata making rounds in our country. For instance, among the bhils on the border of Rajasthan, the Garasia bhils, there is a complete version of what they call the Mahabharata. And it is not a vulgarized, diluted form of the Mahabharata, but it is an independent, different Mahabharata, probably dating prior to Vyasa's Mahabharata. So there have been many Mahabharats, and the renderings of this poem in the form of theatre, in visual arts, paintings, sculpture, dance, music, literature, have literally been in thousands. There is not a single century for the last 2000 years when the Mahabharata was not recreated, and translations of it in practically every language have been around ever since the languages emerged. I mean, there is a medieval Tamil translation, a Kannada translation, which actually gave great impetus to the Kannada language. There has been a translation of a small part of the Mahabharata in Marathi, making Marathi a language of literature. Jnaneshwara's translation of the Gita made Marathi a language. Earlier, it was not language used for writing. This is the story with practically every language. And when English reached India, there were English translations. I mean, Ganguly's translations almost 100 years ago. When the Persian language reached India, there was a Persian translation. Dara Shikoh produced a translation of the Mahabharata in the Persian. So the Mahabharata has touched the life of every language, whether it is a mainstream language or a tribal language. It has touched the life of every form of art in India, whether performing art, visual art, or literary art. And it has touched the life of every section of the society, whether these are crorpatis or beggars, highly literate or completely uneducated. So this all-pervasiveness of the poem is inescapable for anybody living in India. And therefore, I wanted to understand what is the secret of this spread of the Mahabharata, a myth as well as the real poem. Myths surrounding the Mahabharata and myths within the Mahabharata, as well as the actual corpus of the poem called the Mahabharata. That was my curiosity.
But Professor, when you say Bhandarkar Institute produced an authorized version, in the light of what you have just said of thousands of versions, what is an authorized version?
I wish I could answer that in the context of the Mahabharata, but the story is as follows. There was a poem called Jaya Itihasa, composed approximately 8 centuries before Christ. It was in an oral form, and this poem itself was a collection of many sagas, many ballads, many heroic stories remembered and carried forward in the oral form. Then, some 6 or 7 centuries after the first emergence of this poem, which had at that time 24,000 lines, in the 2nd or 1st century before Christ, a man with a tremendous artistic ability and political understanding recreated this poem, and he called it the Mahabharata. The earlier poem was Jaya Itihasa or Bharat. He created the Mahabharata. His name is believed to be Vyasa. Vyasa has another name, and that is Krishna Dvaipayan. That is a dark resident of an island. There is within the second version mention of a third writer, scholiast, somebody who actually wrote down this. And the name ascribed to that character is Ganesha. But despite being written reportedly as per the first book of the Mahabharata, the Adi Parva, the continuity of the poem remained in the oral tradition. So there was a written text somewhere. And the written text was getting reproduced in the written form every 2 or 3 centuries by various people at various places, sometimes learned cities and sometimes plain villages. For instance, Sankheda is a village with no Brahminical tradition, but a manuscript was found in Sankheda when Bhandarkar Institute started its work. This situation continued till India started using paper, that is in the 13th century. And then the rewriting of the Mahabharata versions continued at different locations, deep south in Tanjore, or in central India, or in the Kashmir and Bengal, in many parts. All of these versions were collected by the Bhandarkar Institute. They compared these versions line by line and decided the higher probability occurrence of a given line. So if a line occurs in out of 1600 odd manuscripts they collected, if a line occurs in 2/3 of those, then they included it in the authorized version. The other lines which did not have same frequency of occurrence in all the collected manuscripts were relegated to the footnotes of the authorized version. And this authorized version was created in 18 volumes because the Mahabharata is believed to have been distributed originally 2000 years ago into 18 adhyayas. So to say who wrote the Mahabharata is extremely difficult because there is no the Mahabharata. There are many Mahabharata traditions. In Pandwani there is one. In the class Jayadeva's Gita Govind, there is another Mahabharata tradition. In Yakshagana in Karnataka, there is a third one. In Tamasha in Maharashtra, there is a fourth one. The Billi Mahabharata is a fifth one. There are many Mahabharatas. A.K. Ramanujan, the poet, had the best statement to make on this. He said, in India, everybody knows the Mahabharata because nobody reads it.
But when you say, I was very intrigued, you said you wrote a contemporary version because every society, every period writes its own contemporary version. In our context today, what do you mean by contemporary version?
See, first let me allude to some of the other attempts to do that. There have been fiction writers who have used stories from the Mahabharata to present their worldview and their highly complex characters. In some cases, their politics. For instance, Mahashweta Devi used the Draupadi character to depict the situation of the tribals. Shashi Tharoor did the story again to depict this political situation of India around the independence time and soon after that. First, let me allude to some of the attempts during the 20th century, attempts of recreating the Mahabharata, using the Mahabharata. There are a number of fiction writers who used the Mahabharata story for putting across their thematic interests. Vyas Khandekar in Marathi presented the story of Yayati. Kannada writers such as Bhairappa have produced the same similar stories in Kannada. Mahashweta Devi used the Draupadi character to speak about the situation of tribals. Shashi Tharoor wrote a novel in order to interpret his understanding of India around the time of independence and soon after that time. So attempts have been made. My attempt is different in that I am not trying to revisit any particular character in the Mahabharata or a particular episode in the Mahabharata to present the meaning of that episode or present the psychology of that character once again, matching that with contemporary understanding of the human mind or contemporary political situation. What I am doing is to see if the Mahabharata had an idea of nation, because Bharat, the first name of the poem, also happens to be the one of the two names of this country. The constitution says Bharat, that is India. So I wanted to see if the Mahabharata has an attitude to its past comparable to the attitude to India's past that is being promoted today. Quite frankly, I was trying to see if the Mahabharat's attitude to the past, its past, in any way supports the idea of paranoid nationalism today. And my finding is that the two are exactly opposite.
So that is actually fascinating because ultimately you do link it in some way to the India of today, what is happening using the device of the nation. So in a sense, it is not only contemporary, it is strongly so because it really gets into a notion of, I hesitate to say politics, but certainly a political idea of what is happening today and how the Mahabharata would look at it, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. I mean, my book is political. It is political. There is no point in my saying it is not political. Let me say why it is political. First, the Mahabharata was produced at a time when all the Shastras and the Smrutis were being produced. So, for instance, Manusmruti, dated correctly in its history of creation, was almost the exact contemporary of Vyasa's Mahabharata. Mahabharata remained accessible to all people, whether Brahmin or non-Brahmin. The Smrutis and the Shastras were restricted to Brahmins alone. So the Mahabharata had from day one a take on the question of knowledge. And that take was that knowledge, unless it is democratic, unless it is accessible to the entire demos, cannot be knowledge. So the Mahabharata is a challenge to the idea of Brahminical control over the rest of the society. And that is against the RSS political ideology. Second, the Mahabharata talks of beginning of Indian history, but it talks of many beginnings. It makes, if the Vyasa's Mahabharata explicitly makes attempts to tell us that we can understand history of India only if we look at it as having many beginnings. The moment we reduce it to a single beginning, it no longer remains an authentic history of India. That flies in the face of the new proposition on history of India that things like the IIT Kharagpur calendar or the committee to rewrite history of India for the last 12,000 years. So the Mahabharata has an answer for Indian people today to the issues raised by the RSS, which conflict with our democratic composition of the society. And finally, the third thing, at the beginning of this story, Mahabharata, the original Mahabharata, there is a report about how it was recited in an ashram. In this ashram, a very, very strange, fierce-looking person enters and recites some verses, and the children in the ashram gather around him. And since they like the story, they say, "Please tell it again to us." So he says, "Ashtadasha sahasrani, ashtadasha shatani cha, aham veti shuko veti sanjaya veti vanava." I know about 8,000. Sanjay knows another 8,000 or so. Shuka probably knows yet other 8,000 or so. Because the original Jaya Ityasa had 24,000 verses. Now the point here is, Shuka belonged to a caste category, which was very different from Sanjay's caste category. Quite different from this singer's caste category. The singer had come from forest, almost like a tribal. Shuka was a low caste person, and Sanjaya was close to the Brahminical fold, halfway through Kshatriya and Brahmina. Now, the Mahabharata brings all the classes together. I am saying in this book that if our Bharat follows the Mahabharata, then we will learn how to live within the constitutional framework as a federal country. See, Ramayana is probably a unitary epic. Mahabharata has many heroes. It has many communities. It accepts all of them on equal footing. And that makes it a very different kind of poem. It is not about whether Karna got his rights and Arjuna got his rights, and whether Arjuna won the war or Duryodhana won the war, because the structure of the poem tells us very clearly that it continues way beyond the war, 18 days war. There are several books coming after the war. The poem describes a period of 68 years after the war was over. So it is not a book about a war between Pandus and Kauravas and Pandavas. It is a poem about a vision of history and a vision of society, which was ruled out at the time of its creation by the Sanatani Vedic people. And so Mahabharata belongs to the larger tradition of India. I am giving a reminder of that tradition in the context of today's India. Thank you.
Let me ask you a question in the context of the India of today, the contemporary India. Generations of Indians have grown up with these stories of the Ramayana and Mahabharata, hearing them from their parents, their grandparents, perhaps their teachers. They have seen it on television, and they have read books, including the popular Amar Chitrakatha comics. Two questions arise from here. One, do you think their minds are already made up? And second, would they be prepared to receive a version that challenges those old notions?
Well, one thing is, Indians who love Mahabharata in any form will not allow their understanding of the Mahabharata be influenced by any contemporary sectarian understanding of the Mahabharata. The people of India carried the Mahabharata forward with love, not respect, love, affection. It is theirs. They belong to that. That is the sense. Exactly the way the people of India have carried forward the Constitution of India. Many of them have not read it, but they all think that that is where the hope is. So the Mahabharata of ancient times has that status in the minds of Indians. Now, as far as people's having made their minds about the meaning of the Mahabharata, the expanse of this poem is such that nobody, rarely anybody grasps the entire poem. They know snippets, they know parts. They know when Abhimanyu entered the Chakravyuha, he could not get out. They know that Draupadi was disrobed. They know that Bhishma died after the sun entered the northern hemisphere. But there are many, many more things in the poem because it has 100,000 verses and literally thousands of stories in that. So one does not know the entire poem. There is also, Sidharthji, a popular belief in all parts of India that nobody can keep all books of the Mahabharata inside one's house. There is some superstition attached to that. Therefore, nobody ever brings the Mahabharata home like one brings William Shakespeare or Rabindranath Tagore's books home and read all of it and then make a sense of it. One allows the folklore and the natural flow of snippets of the Mahabharata come one's way and makes an opinion about it. Very rarely any scholars have actually attempted to present a sense of the complete Mahabharata. There have been 3 instances in the past. One was in the 9th century, a man called Rajashekhar. He used to write in the Maharashtri Prakrut as well as Sanskrit. Wrote, making a complete sense of the Mahabharata. Some 200 years after him, a man called Abhinav Gupta, who lived in Kashmir, tried to make a complete sense of the Mahabharata. And after Abhinav Gupta, it was in the early 20th century, nearly 9 centuries later, a man called Aurobindo Ghosh, known now as Sri Aurobindo, tried to make the sense of complete Mahabharata. I have made that attempt in that tradition of interpretation. But my interpretation is not focused towards theological understanding or understanding of fidelity between the fidelity of the Mahabharata with other scriptural texts. My understanding is focused more towards understanding the relevance of the Mahabharata as a corrective text in the times of a mass euphoria about what Bharat has to be. So I have not dismissed my responsibility as a literary critic while writing the book. It is not a pamphleteering kind of book. It has its politics, but its primary framework, the primary framework of my book is to give answers to questions like who actually wrote it, when was it written, how much history is covered in it, what has been his journey, what does he try to say, why did Vyasa, after all, decide to compose such a poem. So I try to answer those questions as well in my little book.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Namaste, this is Cyrus Brocha. I am part of the government cancel culture program to remove rubbish off all the different streams available. So what we have is all the collected rubbish we put together on our show. It's called Cyrus Says. It's on IVM Podcast. You have to watch it and listen to it. It's on our app. It's on our website. It's on the YouTube channel. It's on Facebook. There are many different ways. Don't bother me and ask me how. You have to find out. We talk to different personalities. Many of them are known. Some are just people we meet downstairs and invite them up for chai. But the point is, it's fun and it's very therapeutic. So please join in and listen to Cyrus Says.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. The stories you mentioned, they tell us about honor, valor, even cheating, like chicanery, as I was saying, and lies, because even Yudhishthir, with his exalted values, ultimately lies. So these are important lessons, but ultimately, don't you think it's a morality tale?
No, I don't think morality was a concern for the original writer of the Mahabharata or people who interpreted the Mahabharata. The aim of the poem has been, and aim of many of his interpretation has been, to lead people to realization of what reality is and how one can situate oneself, how the consciousness can relate with that reality. The Mahabharata never says do this or do not do this. If a character within the Mahabharata says do this, there are other characters who say something completely contrary and do this. I will give an example to explain this. For instance, while giving the origin of the Kuru clan, the family of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, the origin, Vyasa narrates a story of great incest between Yama and his sister Yami. Yami is, the sister is greatly after seeking love in all forms from Yama. And this story, Vyasa does not dismiss this story, does not try to conceal it. He presents this story as the story of the origin. But all that he says is, this is one origin. There are other origins as well in myth or in history. And then he tells those stories of those origins also. Similarly, he does not depict the characters we think are heroic in heroic light. As a poet, his method was to be very racy, to be very, very rapid. I mean, he was almost like a war commentator, giving account of blow by blow. But his job was to cover a tale of 7 generations. He discussed this in this poem: 7 generations, 3 preceding the war, 2 involved in the war, and 2 following the war. So, and he uses great economy of words. If some great hero dies in that war, he does not spend too much time there. He uses maybe 2 lines or 3 lines and then moves on. Towards the end of this poem, when all the princes are dead, Kauravas are dead, and the funeral pyre is burning, Vyasa shows their mother standing there but looking at a mango tree which has a ripe mango, and her mind goes to that ripe mango. No character is shown in heroic light in the poem. Vyasa shows the characters only as characters. He does not allow his characters to occupy the space in the poem. He occupies the space, not for moralizing, but for creating a vision of life. And that vision says that life has many beginnings and many ends. And whatever you do here has its impact on to which end you will go. So it is not a poem about religious ethics, theological ethics, or social ethics. It is a poem about what is judiciousness in an individual's behavior as an individual and as a ruler. It talks about Rajadharma, the word that Vajpayee had used in his first visit to Gujarat after the Gujarat riots.
What I mean is that the morality part is not maybe the author's take on morality, but we take it away in the sense, a mother might say to a child, don't lie because these are the consequences of lying. Valor, Karan and Arjuna seen to be valorous. Karan actually became quite a popular name because of his sense of sacrifice towards his guru. He dies. So the point is that we take away what we want to. And in fact, it's very interesting that Karan became a very popular name some decades ago.
Yeah. See, thank you for mentioning this. Vyasa has an extraordinary way of showing the heroism of Arjuna by telling us that Arjuna is one hero among all the Pandavas who is capable of experiencing femininity. You'll be surprised to know in the Gita, in the very first, in the second adhyaya of the Gita. Gita is part of the Mahabharata, which was later added to the Mahabharata, but now it is settled within the Mahabharata corpus, so we call it part of the Mahabharata. In the second adhyaya, Krishna says to Arjun, Kalaibyam masma gama partha. Do not feel like you lost your masculinity. Arjun says that he feels that he has lost his manliness. He confesses that. There's a second occasion, and this is in the war. Prior to that, during the Vanavasa, there is a situation where Arjuna actually dresses like a woman, dances like a woman. He assumes the role of Brahannada. Brahannada means a woman which has all capabilities, all capable woman power. So often, again and again, Vyasa tries to show how women can play a great role in life political, life social, and life individual. And so none of his women in the poem, whether it is Draupadi or Kunti or Ganga, none of them adhere to any of the ethical boundaries that a text like Manusmriti was trying to impose on the society. Think of the amount of rebellion in this poem. He has Ganga saying that, saying to her husband, look, I'm not going to tell you where I'm sending the children. And she was supposed to end the life of 7 of her children. She does that. And she says, do not hold me accountable. Similarly, the ultimate offense, where does the war begin? The war in that begins with a game of dice. Draupadi's disrobing, where Krishna stands with her, is the turning point in the war. Earlier, these Kauravas had done so many things: stealing cows, attacking, confiscating land, beating these Pandavas, torturing them, everything that. Vyasa's Mahabharata is about woman's heroism, not about man's heroism. And I'm not giving a feminist interpretation. I'm not. It is actually Vyasa writes these lines throughout the poem again and again. Vyasa is emphasizing. He states in so many lines again and again, repeatedly, that a society can lead to being a happy society where women have their space, where, just as earlier I said, all communities should have their space. This is very different from a text which gives ethical instructions, ethical norms, do's and don'ts in the society. The Mahabharata is about freedom, about liberty, about courage necessary to gain that freedom. And it is not just those lovely mythical stories told for entertaining children. The Mahabharata, there were other stories written in the past in India for entertaining children. They are called they are in a compendium of stories called Katha Sarit Sagar. But Mahabharata was composed for adults. It has always been performed before adults, and they are not like Aesop's stories, Aesop's tales. The Mahabharata is a philosophical, political text, and Indians have imbibed it in their minds. People who are completely illiterate understand the essence of the Mahabharata, even if they do not know all of it.
Obviously, your approach is a little political, very political. In fact, generations of children have heard the stories, and perhaps even their parents have not been able to understand or impart the larger concepts. But perhaps it is the stories with which we enter. And I was just thinking while you were telling us about this background that nowadays the Bhagavad Gita is used by management consultants and management experts and corporates to, in fact, they cherry pick what they want to and talk about only certain parts of it, how one should restrain one's conscience in a war. And that is hardly the whole story, isn't it?
That's right. So actually, that has been happening with the Mahabharata as well. And many writers, ever since printing came to India, many writers have tried to cherry pick stories from the Mahabharata and put in their own interpretation. I have tried to bring all of the Mahabharata together and present in Vyasa's version, Vyasa's words, what he thought the Mahabharata was for him. I mean, I have an interpretation there, but I have not imposed my interpretation on the Mahabharata. I am very respectful of the original poet. However, I am very explicit when I say that the contemporary Hindutva brigade hardly understands what the Mahabharata is or was, and I feel so. Because the Mahabharata is much greater than dynasties, sects, schools of philosophy. They are come and gone. But this corpus of stories and vision stayed with us, and therefore it is bound to have some great strength in it. So I was trying to measure the height of our time or the shortness of our times against the height, the stature of the
So Professor Devy, this is really fascinating. It's also worth thinking about. Your book makes this whole idea quite relatively accessible to us. And for that, I hope more people read it to understand the context, the wider context of what this millennia-old set of poems say and come from. And for that, we thank you very much, Professor Devy.
Thank you for having me here. Before I leave, I just like to add one sentence in praise of the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata was composed in Sanskrit at a time when Prakrit, Pali and Tamil had already become extremely well developed. And so Mahabharata brings in great virtues of thought from Pali, Dravidic, Proto-Dravidic and Prakrut as well. And in that sense, it is a poem of entire India. It is a poem of Mahabharata. Thank you indeed. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So thank you, Professor Devy, once again. And with that, we come to the end of this episode. Join us next week again for another episode and another guest on the Wire Talks. Till then, bye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the IVM team.
You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
Hey everybody, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Storytellers and Storytellers, Vineet talks to music producer Kabir Katpalia. He shares what it was like making music for the film Gerhaiya. On Think Fast, Varun and Suchita are in conversation with Front Row's Ishanpreet Singh. He tells us about all there is to know about the subscription model. On the Wire Talk, Sidharth talks to author Pramod Kapoor about his new book, 1946 Royal Indian Navy Mutiny, The Last War of Independence. On Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav traces the legacy of Sindhis and tells us why crocodiles are important to them. And on Say No to Drama, Chetna deconstructs growing up but not growing apart in a relationship. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. The word of mouth really helps. Also, don't forget to rate us on whatever platform you're listening to us and check us out on YouTube. You can check a list of all our channels at ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Bank of Baroda and HDFC Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Eventually, you'll see the end of your childhood,
Get accustomed to womanhood.
enjoy the experience of sisterhood,
Might get to wifehood
or not, choose motherhood,
or not. You'll learn to define your personhood.
earn a livelihood,
Change the neighborhood.
and get rid of the falsehood that life post-academia is easy.
So join me, Ritasha,
And me, Ayushi,
on a journey from station starting point
to station, what now?
next station, Pudin station, and hopefully Agla station, adulthood.
Fresh episodes out every Thursday.